welcome everyone. My name is Sigrid Schmalzer. I'm a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm really delighted to welcome you all on behalf of the Critical China Scholars. I've been asked to say just a few words up front about how this group came to be. So far, we're about a dozen people. Most of us first came together at a very inspiring symposium titled The China Question, Toward a Left Perspective on China, which was held on January 25th at the Verso Space in Brooklyn. Kevin Lin, who is managing the backstage of today's event, was one of the chief organizers of that January 25th symposium. And as many of you know, he's a researcher of Chinese labor politics. So following that event, we began a series of conversations on the need to bring together leftist China scholars based in the West to intervene in what has become an increasingly challenging and dangerous political arena. On the one hand, critical statements about the PRC are being used, weaponized by Western politicians of many stripes to stoke xenophobia. This has frightening ramifications for people all over the world, especially Chinese people and people of Asian heritage globally. And then on the other hand, the response from some leftist quarters has been to defend the Xi Jinping regime in ways that really ignore the serious violations of human rights and which threatens to throw dissidents under the bus. So our group is committed to advancing on the public stage a political analysis that actively resists xenophobic rhetoric while still being critical of oppressive PRC policies and standing in solidarity with activists in China who are fighting for labor rights, civil liberties, gender equality, justice for Uyghur people, and many other important causes. We recognize the important groundwork laid by those who came before us, most especially the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars, and also the ongoing work of such organizations as the Lausan Collective and the Made in China Journal, among others. We seek to add our voices to theirs as scholars who bring a critical leftist lens to the study of a wide range of subjects in China, past and present. And we're very happy that you're joining us here today. We hope you will join us for the second roundtable, which is taking place on July 2nd. It's going to have very much the same format as this one, but it's going to be focusing on the topics of against racism and nationalism. And we also just hope that you'll keep in touch with us as we grow as an organization. Before I turn it over to Rebecca Carl, who will be facilitating, moderating today's roundtable, just a few points on Zoom participation and etiquette. We have set the settings to not allow people to unmute themselves or to share screens. There are just so many of us, and it's important that we be able to proceed in a smooth fashion. We are going to have time later in the session for people to ask questions, but we'd like you to do that by typing questions into the chat because it will not work for us to be unmuting specific people with this many people in the room. So we'll be monitoring the chat and aggregating the questions, and we'll hope to cover as much as possible, but that'll be the best way for you to communicate your questions to us. Just also a note that we do expect good behavior in the chat room. We will be removing people if there are, violations of, basic decorum. And one other small matter of business, if you do get disconnected and have a hard time getting back into the Zoom meeting, please do feel free just to move over to the Facebook page. Facebook Critical China Scholars is the name of that Facebook page, and it is live streaming over there, and you can also post comments over there. So I'm going to go ahead then and turn it over to Rebecca Carl.
Thank you so much, and welcome to this webinar. I just want to say, in order to make sure that we continue with a stable connection, if people can turn off their videos, it would be really lovely, just so that we have, where this is global, and so we're having, we want to make sure that we retain a stable connection. My name is Rebecca Carl, and I teach at New York University, an institution whose New York City campus is situated on the homelands of the Lenape people, and whose global imperial campuses, including in Shanghai and Abu Dhabi, are situated on lands from which indigenous and working people have been violently evicted by the combined forces of capitalist development and state power. I also want to note that in the United States, today is the eve of Juneteenth, the day that marks the final freeing of formerly enslaved Black people in the United States after a long, divisive, and apparently still inconclusive civil war. At the same time, the world is in the midst of the COVID pandemic, during which the most vulnerable and most essential are disproportionately paying with their health and lives. These are all linked historically and experientially, and I remark upon it so as to situate myself and us in a particular moment and place. But even more important, because I wish to locate our efforts today in a very long sequence of leftist resistance to the erasure of historical memory, in ongoing leftist contributions to rethinking and refashioning our various worlds, and in leftist opposition to systemic oppression, wheresoever it happens and whichever form it takes. What do China scholars have to say about history in the present? Our first panel, Against Capitalism and Imperialism, is intended to open the question of the world in China today to critical scrutiny from within the age-old leftist paradigm of anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism. While we reference this paradigm as one bottom line of any leftist position, we do not pretend that the designations, capitalism, imperialism, leftism, have remained stagnant over time, and nor even that the definitions of these isms are settled or ever have been settled. At the least, however, and in today's global conditions, those of us who form the Critical China Scholars Group do not choose whose capitalism or imperialism is worse or more worthy. We are not advocates for one state over another, and indeed we are not statist or ethno-nationalists at all, even while we acknowledge that nationalism historically, once upon a time, was a radically progressive position. By the same token, we are not alarmists about China's rise, and we do not regret in any way an end to U.S. global hegemony. Rather, we strive to be as radical as reality itself, as Lenin said of revolutionary movements over a century ago. What we wish to examine and discuss broadly are the conditions of possibility for solidarity and radical political thinking and activism in the context of increasing global tension between states, within states, among peoples, and among corporate entities. Thus, in the complex context of emerging and enduring popular movements in Hong Kong, in the US, in France, in the UK, in Australia, Brazil, and around the world, how can we, as leftists, address shared ideological terrains and yet also intervene in particular material problems? We do not pretend that we have all the answers, or for that matter, all the questions. However, this is our wager, that there's a strong global premise for broad solidarity and expansive inclusivity among leftists globally, and that our analytical capacities and activist practices can be bent towards advancing that agenda. Our mini panels are organized by pairs of speakers. I will introduce each pair before they speak, and I will pose an initial question to them. Each speaker will be limited to about 5 minutes. After all three pairs have spoken, we'll open the field to discussions. Again, please post your questions or reactions in the chat room or on the Facebook live stream, and we'll attempt to aggregate and get to as many as we can. So our first pair of speakers is Andy Liu and Jake Werner. Andy Liu teaches, and they'll be talking about U.S.-China relations in the broad context of COVID-19. Andy Liu teaches at Villanova University and is the author of the recently published book, T-War, A History of Capitalism in China and India. And Jake Werner is an incoming research fellow at the Global China Initiative at Boston University. His work encompasses U.S.-China relations and is published in The Nation, Foreign Policy, and other venues. So Andy will speak first, and I just want to kick us off by asking Andy that the following, and Jake, both of them, to speak to the following question. While the so-called new Cold War between China and the U.S. has been in formation for some time with the trade war and other arenas of potential conflict, how has the COVID-19 pandemic crystallized the contradictions between U.S. and Chinese global hegemony? So Andy, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in tonight or in the morning, wherever you are. So I think my job here is to kind of set the table for everyone else, to kind of take us from the specifics and the details of COVID-19 and the pandemic to the bigger picture. I think, one of the things we wanted to talk about was the scapegoating of China, but also vice versa, the sort of controlling the narrative from the CCP side in China. From the US side, I think the scapegoating of China kind of reaches this fever pitch, an apex in March through May. And that seems like a long time ago now because so much other stuff has happened the last few weeks, hopeful stuff that honestly I wish could continue throughout the rest of the year. But unfortunately, I think it's a safe prediction that the scapegoating of China will make a comeback, certainly in time for the presidential and the broader elections in November in the United States, but probably through the indefinite future as well. So that's something that we wanted to get ahead of in our discussions today. And so as a point of departure, I think it might be useful to sort of briefly work through some of the particular details of the COVID-19 pandemic and the trading of words between China and the United States, so that we can talk about the general contradictions, right, that are beneath the surface but are also sort of hiding in plain sight. So the details themselves, I think we're all familiar at this point with the story of the outbreak of the COVID-19, late December, early January in China. By January 23rd, the city of Wuhan has shut down. But since then, the Donald Trump administration, United States officials have claimed that the Chinese government had lied, delayed, covered up things, bullied the WHO in the meantime. Now, a few of us have kind of gone through a lot of the claims by the Trump administration, the ones that they've sort of signaled will be a big part of their campaign in the fall in order to deflect responsibility and scapegoat China for their very obviously corrupt or inept administration. And pretty much everything they say about what the Chinese government did was at worst a lie, but at best hypocritical, right? In the sense that the United States government's actions were not much better, if at all. So just to give some examples without going too in depth for now, there's obviously probably the most common claim is that the Chinese government delayed telling the world, they covered it up. And, even if this is true, like at most the Chinese government waited 20 days, right? From like this January 1st to January 23rd. But according to the Washington Post or, many credible outlets, the United States federal government, after that January 23rd date, waited 70 more days, right? 70 more days. And they still haven't done nearly as much as the Chinese government did to contain the outbreak. And another Washington Post article has said the U.S. government was actually probably aware of nearly as much as the Chinese government was willing, as much as the central government knew as well, as early as January 3rd, right? So the U.S. government doesn't really have much of an alibi in that sense. There's also the claim that China bought up all the medical supplies, and that's why there's such a shortage of protective equipment in American hospitals. But we also know from, again, the Washington Post that actually from January through March, the Trump administration was actively selling American medical supplies to China, which isn't hard to believe if you know anything about Trump and Jared Kushner, right? So they would be as responsible for the sending of supplies to China as anyone else. But even if those supplies had stayed in the United States, they would have been just a fraction, right, of what the United States needed to deal with the pandemic here. So it's really not about this China hoarding question. It's really kind of a deflection for the government to say that. So what is the point of this? What is the point of this sort of pedantic fact-checking? I think it is important first to kind of get ahead of this, talk about the empirical details so everyone is sort of on the same page. As far as the political thrust, is our goal just to defend the Democrats, the Democratic Party, right? And pretty clearly, that's not the case. That we want to stand outside of any sort of partisan conflict. And if anything, Joe Biden and the Democrats have kind of signaled very early on that they too will try to engage in this competition to outdo the Republicans in demonizing China and blaming them for the problems for the COVID pandemic. So we want to push any party, right, but it's probably especially the Democrats, to reject that type of demonization. And there's several articles coming out this week that suggest that both parties are going to engage in this. So we want to, sort of refuse that kind of false choice. Is the goal to defend the PRC government? No, right? We should also be brutally honest about any mistakes that the PRC government did take and is continuing to take in the aftermath of COVID-19, the outbreak of January in the spring. And for their purposes, the CCP, just as much as the Trump administration wants to control the narrative, their economy was also tanked by the springtime pandemic. This is a threat to their domestic legitimacy, right, where they've had a shrinkage of economic growth for the first time in decades. And it's a threat to their global legitimacy, where there's a lot of talk now of quote unquote decoupling from China that would threat a lot of their investment and trade plans overseas. So just as a brief takeaway, I think as a starting point, we want to say that the COVID crises exacerbate a lot of insecurities of both the Chinese and the United States ruling classes, but absent COVID, there was a lot of tensions that were already being accelerated. And rather than becoming invested in one country's nationalism versus another country's nationalism, we should interpret this kind of pair of nationalisms or kind of series of nationalisms around the world as symptomatic of or products of a global system and longer patterns that are both on the surface but also kind of hiding in plain sight underneath the surface. So with that, I think, Jake, I think we'll elaborate more on those, what exactly we're talking about there.
Okay, thank you, Andy, Rebecca, welcome everyone. So as Andy says, I think the most important thing here is to stop thinking in terms of individual nation states facing off against each other. This is a common way to sort of think through the politics, but it's also a common way to conceptualize the conflict, and that's going to get everything wrong. So to visualize a better way of thinking about the conflict, I want to suggest we imagine two people who are stuck in a room and the walls are slowly closing in on them, pushing them against each other. But that larger structure, those walls that are closing in on them, increasingly forcing them up against each other is, for whatever reason, it's invisible to them. So how are these people going to react to this? They'll think, hey, what is this guy all up in my space for? And increasingly they'll feel outraged. Like, what is this guy doing? Why is he doing it? There must be something wrong with him. He must wish me ill. And eventually they're going to start lashing out at each other. And when the one guy hits the other guy, they'll think it's self-defense. But when the other guy hits them, they'll think that that other guy is being motivated by nefarious designs. So if these two people are the US and China, then that room whose walls are increasingly forcing them against each other is the global economy. And that situation where the space in the global economy is closing down for possibilities both for the US and China is a really deep change from the 90s and the aughts, when the US and China occupied essentially complementary positions in the global economy. So that doesn't mean that everyone in both countries benefited in those decades. We know that there was tremendous suffering and oppression that went with the neoliberal free market orientation of the global economy. And we also know that there is a kind of structural subordination within the structure of the global economy in which countries such as China that are primarily producing for cheap manufactured goods are below in the hierarchy, are below countries like the United States that occupies the most important space of finance, corporate headquarters, research and design. So we know that the neoliberal globalization was unjust in many ways, but at both elite and popular levels in the 90s and the aughts, there was this sense that working together was beneficial. And both elite and popular ideology in both countries supported the neoliberal vision of free markets, global integration, and a cosmopolitan culture. What changed this was the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, which set in motion a series of changes that first began a slow crisis of legitimacy for that ideology in both countries, and second, caused the Chinese leadership to accelerate a development strategy that very quickly directly challenged that ongoing subordination of China in the global economy. So this had been sort of a plan of the Chinese government all along, but it was unfolding very slowly when the export markets that the Chinese government had previously relied upon to keep the Chinese economy going, when those suddenly dried up after 2008 and never really returned in their full vitality because of the collapse of credit bubbles, China transitioned into an industrial policy that accelerated earlier trends and increasingly directly challenged the U.S. position at the top of the global hierarchy. At the same time, the growth prospects within the United States declined substantially. And what that means is that the change in the acceleration of the Chinese development strategy was increasingly perceived as a direct threat by elites in the United States. And at the same time that all of this is happening, the dynamism of the global economy as a whole was seriously damaged. It never really recovered after the crisis of 2008. So all of this is before the pandemic. And what we were seeing already before the pandemic was, in some ways, something similar to what happened after the great economic crisis of the 1930s, Great Depression, which also created a zero-sum global economic landscape that ultimately led to violent great power conflict in World War II. One big difference this time is that that sort of crumbling of the global system, that emergence of a zero-sum dynamic in the global economy, that has developed really gradually. So rather than all at once. And that has given rise to the idea that maybe this time we can do great power conflict without racism, without xenophobia at home, and without international violence in the global system. Now, I think this is a fantasy, and those walls are continuing to close in. And as they continue to close in, it's going to lead to increasingly intense antagonisms and increasingly desperate actions on both sides. And now the effects of the pandemic are seriously exacerbating all of these dynamics. And what I'm particularly concerned about around the pandemic is that what was previously primarily an elite conflict over which country would seize the possibilities of growth in the global economy, the pandemic could create a popular basis for great power conflict in both countries. And we see that with rising nationalism. We see that with the sort of conspiracy theories that are circulating in both the US and China. In many ways, these are completely mirror images of each other, even though they imagine each other to be radically different. So right now, both the US and China are jockeying for position in this sort of slowly emerging zero-sum landscape of the global economy. They're both trying to maximize their chances for survival. I think rather than trying to figure out which side we should be on, rather than picking our team and backing them, rather than trying to figure out how to defeat the other side, we need to take that step back and look at the structure of the global economy that is forcing this confrontation on both countries and on the entire world. And this conflict is going to victimize a lot of people like myself, the other people on this call, who really care about both countries. It's going to victimize all these people caught in between on the conflict. It's already led to an increase of racism on both sides and general xenophobic scapegoating on both sides. So the effects are already there, but they're going to get much worse if we don't, as I say, take that step back, look at the structure that is actually forcing us into this confrontation, and figure out how to reshape the global economy. Hopefully not back to the old sorts of inequalities of neoliberal globalization, but rather towards a kind of global economy that incorporates a much larger part of the world population, that offers possibilities of development to the billions of people who are currently essentially shut out of the global economy, and that does so in a way that builds environmental sustainability and confronts the climate crisis. I think this is the agenda, and getting caught up in nationalism is a sure way to sabotage that agenda.
Okay, thanks to Jake and Andrew for setting us off in this extraordinarily powerful way, where we understand that China scholars must speak from a perspective of knowing China and the United States, but not from advocacy for either country or either system, but from a critique of the global system that has forced. I mean, I like, Jake, your sense of the room. It's not quite Lu Xun's room, not quite the iron room, but it's we're almost there. Okay, should we all wake up, or should we just keep buying enough commodities until we're so sated and so asleep that we don't even care what happens next? Okay, but our proposition is that we should stay awake. So thank you very much on that. We hope to come back to some of these questions, particularly the structural legacies then of this moment. But let's move on now with our next pairing and I've been asked to please ask our participants, since not everybody's native language, including Isabella's, is English. So please speak slowly so that people, or more slowly. I know we have to fit a lot in, but speak more slowly so people can understand. Our next two speakers, in fact, are speaking in languages that are not their primary, they're not their first languages. Isabella Weber and Jun Xu, who will speak about political economy. Isabella teaches at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and is the author of papers on China, neoliberalism, and the global political economy. Her forthcoming book is entitled How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. And Jun Xu teaches at Howard University and is the author of the recently published book From Commune to Capitalism, How China's Peasants Lost Collective Farming and Gained Urban Poverty. And so following on from the structural analysis that we just started hearing about, can you clarify a little bit about how the COVID-19 crisis has helped us clarify China's relation to neoliberalism in the global economy? So Isabella first, if you would. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you everybody for being here tonight. I would like to start by saying that the present crisis really represents a crisis of the global economic order, which builds very much on what Jake just said. And I would like to look at this crisis by sharing reflections on the late days of the Cold War of two Chinese reform intellectuals who were crucially involved in the 1980s reform debate that set China on its present path. One of them is Wang Xiaoqiang, who was the leader of the System Reform Institute and who, among many other things, had worked closely with Zhao Ziyang to develop the coastal development strategy that set China on its export-oriented path in the late 1980s. The other one is Deng Yingtao, who was also part of the young reform intellectuals in the 1980s and early on started to reflect on the limits of the kind of development model that China was embarking on in the late 1980s. I would like to quote from an interview between Wang Xiaoqiang and Deng Yingtao that was undertaken in 2012, shortly before Deng Yingtao passed away of cancer, and that is published in his translated book, A New Development Model and China's Future. This book was written in 1992, and in this interview, those two key protagonists of the 1980s debate reflect back on where China is in 2012. So Wang Xiaoqiang comments to Deng Yingtao, quote, "In China, we used to talk about overtaking the UK and catching up with America. But there you were, Deng Yingtao, insisting that there's no overtaking, no catching up. We can't do what the West does. We can't even have the lifestyles and industries that the West has. You were a very lonely voice amid all the hype of reform." To which Deng Yingtao replies, quote, "So I started thinking then that modernization should not be the same as westernization," and what he's really referring to here is capitalist industrialization. "So is there another model, a mode of resources, production, and lifestyle which would allow the many to modernize, not just the few? The classic model of Western modernization is I modernize, you don't. We can't choose that model. China can't follow the Asian tiger's model. Of course, the coastal regions can import some materials, do some export processing to make some foreign currency, but the model cannot be reproduced across the whole of China. It can't bring modernization to the majority. But they say Japan had an export-oriented economy. I think the problem is one of orders of magnitude. All of China cannot be an export processing zone. It is an error of composition." And Deng Yingtao goes on to argue that the reason why China cannot replicate this resource-intensive capitalist mode of industrialization is that there are basically two limits that would be hit if China tried to do so. The first one is the limit of planetary boundaries, the boundaries of resources available on our planet Earth, the danger of climate crisis, the danger of eroding our nature in ways that could lead to pandemics. The second limit that Deng Tao points to is that the logic of capitalist industrialization is based on the logic of global dependency. As such, it cannot be scaled up to the whole world. As long as capitalist industrialization is pursued, it relies structurally and logically on others lacking behind. And China is too big to forge ahead without undermining this kind of dependency logic, and therefore it cannot follow that same path. I believe that those two limits are basically what is underlying, in a very broad and potentially abstract sense, the present crisis that we are encountering. China, nevertheless, largely has pursued this development model. It was continued, it was conditioned on cheap labor and a subordinate position in the early phase, with a hope to move up the value chain, as the development economists like to say later on. However, as Jake has already been pointing out, the global division of labor that resulted from this is basically what you can read on the back of your iPhone, designed in California and assembled in China. And this basic division of labor continues until the very day, as we could see again in this crisis. For example, when China tried to ramp up its production of ventilators and also masks, and was running into shortages because it couldn't produce the technology-intensive parts itself. China has been trying to escape from this model by shifting to more domestic consumption, upgrading technology, and also shifting to a more sustainable development path. However, this so far has been largely unsuccessful on the scale that would be required, basically because of the kind of strong structural forces that China has locked itself in. For the US, on the other hand, this model means that it has emerged together with core European countries as the headquarter and designer of the world. This also means that American capital has become largely less reliant on labor in America, which again, I think came out in a quite striking manner in this crisis, where as a result of the COVID crisis, today, only about 50% of the American population are employed, compared to 64% in 2000, which is the lowest level since data has been recorded, or that I'm aware of after World War II. At the same time of this total collapse of the labor market, the stock market is faring pretty well. We can also see that as a result of this crisis, the reserve army of labor has simply exploded, which means that even bringing some manufacturing jobs back home will not solve this basic broken relationship between capital and labor in the United States. The deeper this crisis is and the deeper it becomes, the more nationalism and the more scapegoating of China becomes a prevalent discourse. And this crisis is occurring far before we have hit the kind of logical boundaries in terms of dependency that Deng Tao was pointing to. We have to remember that China's GDP is still 1/4 of the United States, according to the World Bank, and in PPP terms, which tends to underestimate the to overestimate the GDPs of poorer countries. China, on the other hand, remains deeply dependent on the US and is struggling its way towards a different kind of development model. But as I say, it has itself reached a crossroads amidst this crisis, with nationalists tending to glorify whatever success China has to celebrate. And on the other hand, we can observe that market reformers are calling with a loud voice for further marketization, further opening up of China's market for global capitalism, trying to clinch to the kind of arrangement that has emerged. So I would like to argue that it's really a crossroads for both the United States and China to find out a path out of this structurally unsustainable arrangement. And as such, I think that it's really a crossroads for the world. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Isabella. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with a group of scholars that I admire. So following Jake and Isabella's talk, I'm going to briefly talk about the question of imperialism in China. I think it's becoming common to argue that China is on its way to replace the United States as the center of global capitalism. I think this view overlooks the way that the contemporary capitalism works. To a great extent, as other people have argued, the US and China still play largely complementary and not competing roles in the world. The US monopolizes science and technology, and with some exceptions, China mostly produces or assembles cheap commodities for the US and others. Imperialism, in theory, ultimately involves a transfer of super profits from the periphery to the imperialist center. And China has not been in that position to extract such profits. In terms of exports, for example, China is mostly competing with lower income countries. And like other lower income countries, the exporters receive a small share of the total value created, and the workers receive an even smaller share. A worker in China would receive much less income than his or her counterpart in the United States, even with the same level of skills. This requires a more repressive institution against labor in China. And the super exploitation in China and the extra profits transferred from China to the United States enables the war against the US working class while blaming the Chinese workers. We can also look at the China's capital investment abroad. China's FDI outflow last year as a percentage of the gross capital formation in that country was 1.9%, while the world average last year was 6%. The majority of such investments abroad went to Hong Kong and a number of other tax havens, either as capital flight or is repackaged as foreign capital, re-entering the mainland China. In any case, I have not seen any strong evidence suggesting that the Chinese capital is becoming more, let's say, imperialistic. As a top Chinese official once claimed, the US and China have, or more precisely, should have a marriage relationship. And yes, the traditional gender roles are clearly implied in this claim. For the most part, the Chinese elites are pretty clear about what they need. They have benefited immensely from the current division of labor in the global economy and have a strong tendency to maintain the status quo. This consensus among the Chinese elites make them often more explicitly interested, even than the US, in, or many others, in defending the US imperialist system. But we know whether that system can survive is obviously out of control of any individual state. The image of a rising China, an imperialist China, interestingly caters to different groups in both China and the United States. The nationalist media in China has been bragging about a powerful China in the last years, decade, and producing this type of propaganda as an effort to reduce militancy among the Chinese working class. At the same time, the right wing in the US has been making their own case based on the same kind of propaganda from China, and utilizing deep-rooted racism and a history of anti-communist, and it serves the goal of scapegoating China and neutralize the US workers. Even some of the more critical observers in and out of China have, I would say, uncritically absorbed the nationalist propaganda and argue that China has now become the #1 enemy of the global working class. So we are seeing the formation of a holy alliance dominated, I would say, by reactionary politics. And unfortunately, I don't think that kind of inaccurate understanding of global capitalism has facilitated a productive, meaningful dialogue regarding China and the world. in a challenging time like right now, we could and probably should have a better discussion based on the political economy of imperialism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Isabella and Jun. That really, you have given us a very short course in why modernization theory and its theory of convergence was never possible and was always a fiction, and that capitalism is always a zero-sum game, and how we might think that in the context of today. Our next paired speakers are, and I want to remind everybody, some people are putting some questions in the chat room, and we're happy to, we will take those up at the end of the first wave of presentations. So keep going, keep putting questions in the chat room. People are there are some among us who are aggregating those questions and keeping track. So that's great. Our next two speakers, Eli Friedman and Yigo Dong, are going to specifically talk about labor and capital. And so they will take up immediately from the ways in which Isabella and Jun have been discussing the structural problems of encountered by workers both in China and the U.S., and how the national states have set those workers against one another in a false mode of competition. But Eli teaches at Cornell University and is the author of Insurgency Trap, Labor Politics in Post-Socialist China. And Yigo Dong will be teaching starting in fall 2020 at the University of New York at Buffalo, and is working now on a book tentatively entitled From Milltown to iPhone City, Gender, Labor, and the Politics of Care in an Industrializing China. And so the question I'd like to pose to both of you is essentially what I already posed. How has the increased conflict with the U.S. and slowing growth in China impacted Chinese workers? And how has that slowdown been felt across sectors? In other words, IT workers versus migrant workers, and in gendered and regional terms. So if you can answer all of that, each of you in 5 minutes or less, that'd be great. Thanks. Eli, you go.
Great, thanks very much. So, my colleagues have done a great job sort of setting the table and thinking about what's going on kind of at the structural level. I just want to point out that COVID-19 has really accelerated a lot of these processes that were sort of already underway. I think this is most clear with the sort of the reorganization of supply chains, the processes of deindustrialization that are already happening in certain regions of China, as that sort of the very low-end labor-intensive forms of manufacturing have been leaving China for a while as wages have gone up and relocating to Vietnam, other places in Southeast Asia, and so on. So, once the sort of the supply chains get broken as a result of COVID, and the sort of the kind of intensified nationalism that has happened on both sides of the U.S.-China relationship, there's increased talk, and I think sort of more serious than in the last few years about, major global corporations sort of reorganizing the supply chains away from China. And that obviously has a huge impact on the tens of millions of workers who have been employed precisely in these supply chains. There's been an ongoing effort going back really to the 2000s. You can go back to 2003, 2004 and see Wen Jiabao talking about a desire to increase domestic consumption, right? And this is something Isabella mentioned, to move away from the reliance on foreign consumers, and particularly American consumers. This is once again accelerated after 2008, where they see the sort of the unreliability of these foreign consumers and a desire to be somewhat more self-dependent. There's been some success at increasing domestic consumption. It's ticked up a little bit over the last few years, but this is not a sort of a major structural realignment. And so employment for, again, tens of millions of workers in China is still dependent on those export markets. And then another major issue, particularly after 2008, there's been a huge increase in debt-financed infrastructure spending, all of the roads, the high-speed rails, the subways, the airports, et cetera, that have given China the sort of largest and perhaps most advanced infrastructure anywhere in the world. That soaked up a lot of labor, right? I mean, construction grew quite rapidly. It's not coming to an end, but it is slowing down really dramatically from where it was in 2010, 2011. So that creates another sort of pressure on employment. So there are some really big questions for workers amidst all of this, and basically the big question is, can the government, in cooperation with capital, both state-owned and private, both domestic and foreign, create enough employment to compensate for the loss of jobs in the export processing sector, in manufacturing? And if so, what kinds of jobs will these be? Will they be decent jobs? Will they be the kind of jobs that can serve as the basis of sort of increased domestic consumption and a kind of, you can think of this as like a 20th century style class compromise. So if we look at sort of the big stories in Chinese economic development, we've heard about the corporate champions, Alibaba, Huawei, Tencent, ByteDance, right, the makers of TikTok. They are certainly generating profits. These companies are very profitable. They are beginning to sort of expand globally and making, in some cases, major technological breakthroughs. But there's actually, in terms of a question of employment, a similar problem to the US. Which is that the most profitable companies actually don't create that much employment, and a lot of the employment they do create is, a small number of sort of programmers. They also create a lot of sort of associated jobs, janitors and caterers and things like that. They're actually not that well compensated. So, those really profitable companies are not. It's not GM in the 20th century, right? They are not sort of serving as the basis again of a kind of class compromise. Where we do see, bigger growth in employment is these kind of, the service sector is growing. We see, delivery workers and logistics, food and beverage, hospitality, retail. The central government has recently been panned for suggesting, what do they call it, the sort of the stall economy, the street vendor economy, basically. Li Keqiang said, well, they should go out there and have sort of informal stalls and they can sell food. This is something that city governments have been cracking down sometimes really brutally on over the last 10 years. And now they're suggesting, well, they should come back because this is a way to provide employment. They seem to have backed away from that a little bit. So, there are some real questions about whether they can create jobs and whether they will be decent jobs. The good news is that Chinese worker resistance has migrated from the industrial sector into the service sector, and there's some sort of data to indicate this and lots of anecdotes. Some of my own research focused on food delivery workers as well as workers in sanitation and taxi, and what we can see is that they are continuing to find ways to resist, sometimes in very low-key ways. The sort of the food delivery workers just like don't sign into the app, and they have ways of coordinating this collectively. These are not sort of major politicized uprisings, but sort of Chinese workers' propensity to resist continues. That being said, this is a time of intense political repression, and that's the case in throughout sort of civil society, and so it is very dangerous to be sort of connecting with students, to connect with NGOs. Things that were possible 5 or 10 years ago are not possible anymore. So the government has really been able to manage the political content of labor unrest, but they haven't been able to stamp out labor unrest altogether. One final thought, just thinking about the themes of capitalism and imperialism going forward. There is this debate about whether China is an imperial power or not. I agree with what Jun just said, that China is not an imperial power or is not yet an imperial power. But if we look at what's happening with labor, I think that we can see some of the kinds of pressures that might push it in a kind of more imperial direction. All that being said, it is pretty certain that China will not have access to the same abundant and super exploitable forms of labor that Euro-American empire enjoyed, right? So mass dispossession, mass enslavement, sort of as the cornerstone of a new racial capitalism with China at the center, does not seem possible to me, if for no other reason than sort of ongoing US military preeminence that would make it extremely challenging or risky. So I think that this suggests that in order to sustain ongoing levels of capital accumulation, the state will have to continue to offer up its own race, which is to say the Han, as a highly exploitable workforce for capital, again, both domestic and international. And so I think that this kind of Euro-American style racialized as well as gendered labor aristocracy that we saw in the 20th century looks pretty unlikely in China. And the interesting thing, and this is the kind of the twist at the end, this comes at a time when there's sort of increasing emphasis on ethno-nationalism, calls for ethnic unity, national revival, and this is an increasingly important part of state legitimacy. So there's this possible kind of tension, I think, emerging between, on the one hand, this enhanced ethno-nationalism and the sort of the necessity that China will largely have to depend on exploitation of Han people in order to realize the dreams of state and corporate power. Thanks.
Oh, okay. So my turn. Thanks, Eli. Thank everybody. And in the next 5 minutes, I'm gonna present three propositions, which are three sets of contradictions that I see relate to the broadly defined labor issue from China. First, I think there's a new round of proletarianization that is affecting both rural and urban residents, and yet the same population is drowning in huge debt. To elaborate a bit, the urban proportion of the population in China has increased from about 1/3 to 2/3 in the last 2 decades. So it means that 2 decades ago, migrant workers were also small peasants who had a piece of land to resort as their last resort of social safety net. Now they're becoming poor proletariat. This transformation is being accelerated by government's big push for urbanization under the banner of consolidating villages, concentrating dwelling, or 合村并居. On the other hand, unlike their parent generation, young workers don't want to put up with the working condition in the sweatshop 360 days a year. They prefer seasonal work, temporary job, service worker in the informal sector that, according to my own observation and research, could make them embedded themselves into a quote-unquote urban culture that they like, which I think to a great extent features a consumer culture. So materially, they're being proletarianized, but culturally speaking, they're into this consumerist culture. Many of the young workers are in huge debt. In fact, consumer debt in China hit 60% of its GDP in 2018. The level in the US is 76% now. So China is catching up very quickly there. What's the implication? I think it implies that before becoming producers who gain some structural bargaining power, Chinese industrial and low-end service workers are now being reshaped into pure consumers and drowning in debt. That's number one. The second proposition, as the current economic model continues capitalizing on cheap labor and resources, there is a deepening crisis of social reproduction of labor and our community, which will in turn jeopardize this accumulation process. To elaborate, like everyone everywhere else in the world, the cost for housing, healthcare, education, those are the chief aspects in social reproduction, are skyrocketing in China. One major reason that we see the quick increase of minimum wage is related to this. In addition to that, though, China is aging at an unprecedented rate. There are now 40 million senior citizens in China who need care service, and the demand has been continuously rising. Also, impressively high demand is maternity care or postpartum care. Right now, there are more than 25 million domestic workers in China, making China the largest domestic care market in the world. With rising demand, care will be further outsourced to migrant workers and the urban poor and even international migrants. Actually, the policymakers are talking about importing workers from the Philippines. They're debating on that. Yet, these sectors are primarily informal, meaning that there's no protection and zero associational power there up till now. It will be very challenging to organize this group of workers whose labor process, so isolated and itemized, does not help solidarity building. My last point, there is a proliferation of class-inflected subjectivities and identities that may not really perfectly fit into a leftist imaginary of working class power. Yet, their identification with progressive cause and the alliance built among these groups would be crucial in search of non-emancipatory politics. To elaborate, I'm thinking about, as Eli mentioned, knowledge workers and the service workers, not at the low end, but the middle and the higher end. When we say Chinese workers today, the majority of them are not industrial workers anymore. The service sector accounts for 45% of China's total employment today, whereas the industrial sector only counts for 28%. This hasn't taken into account that 25 million domestic workers who are in the informal sector yet. These expanding service domains are mainly knowledge workers in IT, finance, and delivery service, so on and so forth. While they have become increasingly visible and sometimes vocal in making demands, as Eli mentioned, and also, for example, it's a very famous case last year, there was this anti-996 campaign among IT workers who asked for shortened hours and better benefits. However, in general, based on initial observation, the IT sphere is politically and culturally conservative, while amenable to libertarian market logic, unfortunately. And also, the last example, recently there's contemporary, a very vibrant, growing community of Chinese feminists. They evolved from just a handful of organizations a decade ago to a group of young vanguard activists a few years ago to now a mass movement. Especially we can see it through the Me Too movement, which is still going on. Well, I debunked the idea that all the Chinese feminist movement are biased toward urban and of bourgeois consciousness. However, I also want to point out that unfortunately, I think this energy from these young Chinese women and their allies may not automatically transform into a more progressive and inclusive agenda. So finally, my point is, I think instead of accusing any of these groups broadly defined as workers, I think it's our job to critically analyze the reality and try hard to make discursive intervention, building solidarity with people across sectors without assuming our theory or knowledge is superior than others. Thank you.
Okay, well, that was great. Thank you so very much, and it gives us a really good sense of the complexities of the working class, that sort of aggregate category, and allows us to start to think about disaggregating it and so on. I'd like to now move, we have about half an hour left, and so, and we have a large number of questions accumulating here in the chat room as well as on our Facebook Live feed. So we're not going to be able to get to everything, but I'm hoping that we will get to enough to whet your appetite to come back on July 2nd for our second panel. Which will be about racism and nationalism, but also and following up on some of these questions. I think we're going to start with the question that has come up now repeatedly in the chat room as well as on Facebook Live about the comment or the position that several of you have taken that China is not imperialist. If it's not imperialist, what would need to change, or what definition of imperialism is being used to determine whether it is imperialist or not? And that then has to do then with, we might be able to link that to the problem of the Belt and Road Initiative, to the BRI, to China's relationship with its neighbors, near and far. It seems to construe neighborhood as very expansive. How might we think the ways in which China has been expanding into other economies, and has the COVID crisis or has the contemporary situation fundamentally altered those trajectories? And so I guess I'll start with Andy and Jake, and I don't know, anybody want to leap right into this question make a signal to me so I can stop talking. Somebody?
I think the imperialism question was Jun and Eli, so they should take it. Who wants to take it?
Jun, why don't you start then with the problem of, and Eli, then you can follow up. Thanks.
Sure, thanks. Regarding the question of imperialism, there is the debate has been going on for quite some years, both within, among the Chinese, let's say leftists or scholars, and also abroad. If we use the traditional Marxian or Leninist definition of imperialism, then it's fairly straightforward that China doesn't fall into that categorization of imperialism. But if you frame imperialism as, let's say, a state, a country that has power over other places, then it becomes a fairly broad definition that you can literally apply to many, many other countries. So I think that is possible to do, but I think it's the Marxian traditional, Leninist definition that remains relevant for us to analyze global capitalism. So that's what I would say. And regarding the mega projects such as the Belt and Road Initiative and many others, I think many of those are still ongoing, and a lot of things are rhetorical, saying we want to do this, we will do this, but how much of those actually being realized, or what kind of exact impact they had on the local economy or local society, I think it's not that clear yet. But we shall wait and see what's really going on with such project. My very primitive observation is that these projects do not resemble the kind of the old imperialist projects that Britain, France, or United States that had, let's say, on the African continent or in the Middle East. It's quite different, but that's my take. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I would just add to that. So saying that I don't think China's imperialist or not yet imperialist is not to say that I think everything it's doing globally is great. I think there's lots of massive problems beginning right in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, et cetera. So I was talking about it in sort of narrowly thinking about labor regimes. And if you look at the way Euro-American empire was organized, the way that they sort of found a population that was super exploitable, which is to say that you can pay them sort of below their, the cost of reproduction, and that can either be through wage labor or enslavement. The space to do that in today's sort of world is just much more constrained. And again, I mentioned U.S. military power. So China is invested, there's factories in Africa. I'm sure the workers are paid poorly and are not treated well. SOAS just did a big report that said, yeah, there's Chinese investment in Africa. They're, maybe not paying their workers very high, but it's the same as just about any capitalist firm. So that's exploitation. It's not sort of imperial exploitation in the way that the United States, UK, France, et cetera, was able to do it. And I think that those kinds of geopolitical and military constraints are going to kind of continue to exist.
Okay, clearly that's a preliminary answer to a very complex question. And Andy, sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So my comment isn't so much about the classic Leninist interpretation, but to bring the focus back to the global context, not just like a domestic discussion of domestic Chinese policy. I think what is interesting is if China is not, let's say, the classic European empire, what is interesting is the perception around the world that China is somehow encroaching upon local populations in a way that is unfavorable. And it's not just the United States. The COVID-19 pandemic, I think, brought to the surface in a lot of places around the world this sentiment that I off the top of my head, I remember reading in Italy and Iran and India recently. My friend John, who I think is in the chat room, showed me videos today of smashing televisions in India. There was comments in Iran and Italy that, they sent us these crappy goods and now they gave us a crappy disease, right? So there is, I guess a question to, well, I don't know if we want to get into definitional debates, right? But I think it's worth thinking about, like, let's say China is still not an empire in the classic European sense. There is still this global resentment against them that I think we have to deal with. What do we do about that? And Jake also mentioned these kind of crazy conspiracy theories, like the 5G, Huawei conspiracy. Like those things we could dismiss them as crazy, but they do, I think, kind of crystallize real antagonisms that the rest of the world faces. So just to kind of bring it back to the global, just to say that the global question is still, perspective is still worth keeping.
Okay, yes. All right. So, how do we retain a global perspective without rehashing or thinking that China is going to emulate exactly a 19th or early 20th century European or American imperial history? What kind of history is being made today that isn't necessarily classically 19th or 20th century, but is turning out to be classically 21st century? So what does that look like? How do we think about it, and so on? I'm going to move on now to a new, to a different question. Not that we've answered that one, but that one's on the table still, and I think it's we have a lot of fodder, a lot of food for thought there. One of the questions, and maybe this actually follows on that one of the questions that has been posed that's quite about, how we position ourselves or how we think about positioning ourselves is how do we find a space between the U.S. and China if and when the Cold War heats up or freezes over, or, however one wants to think about Cold Wars, whether they heat up or freeze. How would we say we would position ourselves as China folks, even if I have China scholars, even if we are not, even if you are Chinese, if you're not Chinese, if you identify as Chinese, however you identify personally, but as leftists, let's say, how do we position ourselves between U.S. imperialism and Chinese state expansionism and state repression? Anybody have some thoughts about that they might want to? Jake, maybe you want to start off with that?
Yeah, this is a key question. I think that the sort of formulation I would put this under is that the regular people in China and regular people in the United States have more in common, and their interests are more aligned than either group is aligned with the interests of the elites that rule over them. And so we need to think about the ways in which transnational solidarity and international cooperation can address some of the shared crises and forms of oppression that really everyone in the global economy is facing right now. So obviously it plays out unevenly, and some people are victimized much worse than others. But just across the world, people are facing insecurity in their livelihood. They're facing a lack of dignity in work. They're facing rising housing costs. They're facing excessive debt. They're facing problems with the delivery of healthcare that have been massively amplified by the pandemic. All of these basic issues of life and livelihood are something that are shared by working people and the underclass around the world. And rather than sort of dividing ourselves up, one country against another, so that each working class can fight against the other working class, we need an analysis that brings to visibility the shared interests of of regular people around the world, and we need to work on forms of coordination and solidarity and organization that can bring this out. Now that's much easier said than done, obviously, but I think that has to be the basic direction of a left politics under conditions of nationalist and emerging nationalist conflict.
Thanks, Jake. I think that it's always easier said than done, and sometimes it's not always easy to say either. So thanks for saying it. Anybody? I mean, I have a third question ready to go. Does anybody else want to weigh in on this one? Okay, then the third question is it's a sort of mashup of two questions from the chat room. That in the conditions of the increase in factory workers' wages that have resulted in factory relocation to Southeast Asia and elsewhere from China have occurred in a new context historically. Declining number of jobs in manufacturing, no major growth in higher wage service sector jobs, and still no significant movement into the elite ranks of the value chain for Chinese firms. How does the picture that Ngos draws of self-precaritization, I didn't say that word right, and debt-fueled consumption among former Nongming, former migrant laborers, reflect broader structural trends? And this impacts then or reflects back on an earlier question that came up in the chat room about the national security law in Hong Kong and what impact that's going to have on Chinese labor NGOs to continue to function, or Chinese labor to continue to be militant or resistant to various propositions. So Ngos, if you might want to take that up first, and then somebody else can weigh in after that.
Sure, thanks. And this is a complex question. I'll try to be concise. I think first I see a explicit negative impact because of the upgrade of the industry. As I said, right, on the one hand, your structural bargaining power is weakening because the high unemployment, the sector is now absorbing as many as they used to be. And on the other hand, you are actually more dependent on this that economy. So I saw that. But that does not mean that there's no other way to articulate or to channel anger and the grievance, maybe not along the line of we're all proletarian, like industrial workers, but from somewhere else. Yeah, that's my quick thought on that. And Eli, do you have anything to add on that?
I could say something about Hong Kong, which is a pretty separate question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So the national security law is just the sort of the final nail in a coffin that has been prepared and for a long time. So, as many people might know, activists in Hong Kong played an instrumental role in catalyzing sort of the development of labor NGOs, particularly in Guangdong province, but elsewhere in China. And so that connection in Hong Kong has been really, really critical for decades. And there's been, the NGOs have, there's successes, there's failures, there's they get involved in sort of neoliberal governance. But on the whole, it's a good thing that they were there. But since 2015, a bunch of activists were rounded up in December 2015, and the government has been sort of gradually sort of strangling whatever space existed in mainland China for those activists. And so, I mean, Hong Kong, I was in Hong Kong last November, and everyone was basically saying we can't do anything in China anymore. One sort of interesting effect of that is they all redirected their work to Hong Kong itself, which seemed optimistic at the time. So the national security law is the final nail in the coffin, at least for the time being. And so I think that as a result of that, workers are going to increasingly be on their own, the government may come to regret it, right? Because one of the things that NGOs did is it sort of funneled people into the legal system. And so if they're not doing that, then, it's just direct confrontation in the workplace, and that creates its own sort of set of problems.
Rebecca, sorry, can I just add?
Please, yes.
Very quick one. Sorry, folks, I'm under the weather. That's why I forgot things I want to say. Anyhow, so by saying that, articulating around other lines, I meant that sometimes we create opportunities. Sometimes opportunities are given to us. For instance, I think just right now, there's one of the first legal case about workplace sexual harassment is being fought by a janitor who happened to be a female janitor and who happened to be harassed by her employer. But this case, there are a lot of massive force of feminist force around this, behind her. But we can definitely try to articulate into an issue of both labor and sexual violence. Just a very quick last point. I think everybody knows that when Dr. Li Wenliang died during the outbreak of the COVID in February, you saw one of the biggest national grievance wave going on there. But at the same time, people are talking about Li Wenliang being a healthcare worker. They talk about issues around that. So my whole point is maybe instead of search for the textbook prototypical concept of labor, we look into the reality to think more about what it really means and where we can turn this into. That's my point.
Okay, Jun, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I'll follow up on the Hong Kong question, National Security Act. I think that the decline of labor NGOs, like Eli just mentioned, has been going on for quite some years, right? Since 2015-16, and I think the primary reason for that decline was not so much on the let's say formal on-paper regulation against labor. It has something to do with the capital accumulation within China, the mainland itself. Since 2015-16, the capital accumulation, the speed of that has been slowing down very dramatically. The investment rate has been declining a lot. And so, between the early 2000s and the mid 2010s, there was a decade or so where the Chinese regime has been willing to, work with the labor NGOs or, try to build a little golden age, aka, like the post-war era welfare state. But that was an effort, and they failed quite fairly quickly. After the profit rate declined and the capital accumulation declined. So I think they changed their stance, regarding labor politics or labor NGOs. So that was driven by a long-term trend in capital, how capital works, and the legality, how the legal forms change is of I think it was a minor concern to the working class struggle there. I mean, even without NGOs, the Chinese working class have had successful struggles, and when they, as a history backdrop, and obviously we know the Hong Kong labor NGOs, they moved to the mainland after the Hong Kong manufacturing sector moved to the mainland. So they follow capital accumulation, and now if the capital accumulation move, had other changes, I think it would be, I foresee a future changes to accommodate the changes in the pattern of capital accumulation. And I'm more optimistic about the Chinese working class. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, thanks. I want to pivot to, I want to pose 2 more questions, okay? And because that'll take us approximately to the end of this session. But one of the questions is connected to what we've just been talking about, and what critical position do you think, or do we think, or does everybody think, or do you suppose we might want to take, leftists, that is, on the issue of Hong Kong and Taiwanese nationalism? considering the very strong legacy of Cold War pro-capitalist and colonial mentalities in both places. In other words, are these nationalisms progressive? Are they part of a working class or a radical politics, or are they inevitably reactionary? And how might we think that? The other question that came up much earlier and that I'd like Isabella certainly to speak to if possible is, because it came up during her talk, and so is can we incorporate more agents in the global economy rather than just China and the US, and how do we, I mean, given the hierarchy within the global economy, and the inherently hierarchical nature of it, how do these other agents act, or how might we think these other agents, and so on. But let's go first to the Hong Kong-Taiwan question, and then we will move into the last of the global hierarchy question. So does anybody have anything to say about Taiwan and Hong Kong nationalisms and the left? Andy, yeah.
I'll say a little bit because I've been following it for a while. I think this goes back to, I think, one of the other questions about refusing to, you don't have to romanticize the Hong Kong movements or the Taiwanese movements. There's a lot of problems with them in terms of being very upper class and nationalistic movements, and they engender, I think people are pretty well aware, like in Hong Kong, for instance, they very much talk about these cockroach metaphors when talking about mainland people. So lots of class dimensions there at play. At the same time, I think, so our position, anyone's position, should not be to kind of fall into those false binaries of just having to choose one or the other. One has to kind of, pick a set of values that you believe in. And I think, I think it's pretty clear that, in the choice between the Hong Kong people and the repression of the PRC state, and also what the PRC and the pro-Beijing faction and the police are doing in Hong Kong, and you watch the videos, it's not that different from what's happening in the United States. Like, fuck yes, you watch these videos and you side with the people over the repression of the state that's trying to promote, accumulation in the name of extending endless accumulation and denying rights to the people. Then you keep that space open. And if anything, hopefully through participating in protests, people with quote unquote the wrong mentality, right, it would be radicalized, and they would actually see like what the stakes of this are about. So I think a lot of the abstract debate that's obviously happening on Twitter in the United States is kind of besides the point. This is, and then when you look at the concrete, what's going on the ground over there, then those, what's happening over there should take precedence over these sort of, Trotsky or Stalinist debates.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to say that I think that the process of protest is itself a radicalizing activity, and so perhaps we might want to note that without taking necessarily sides. But Jun, did you have something?
Yes. I want to follow up with the question on the nationalism in Hong Kong and Taiwan. I think, first of all, I mean, I saw, briefly saw a question regarding China's periphery, including, a number of different places. But I think, if we reverse the question, we can also say that the mainland China is a periphery of Hong Kong and Taiwan. Because that's exactly how capital operates. It was Hong Kong capital that first came to the mainland to operate factories, to hugely exploited the Chinese working class. And that surplus has been going to Hong Kong, not the other way around. So I think, there's obviously in terms of the size of territory, in terms of the government power, we do see a huge difference. I think the mismatch, the relationship between the mainland and Hong Kong, for example, if we flip it around, saying, it's United States, let's say it's Hong Kong, it's much more wealthier, more advanced capitalist economy, with Mexico, with lots of cheap labor. And right now, we obviously know that the U.S. government has a superior power over Mexico. But suppose in the Chinese case, is the Mexican government that actually has the political control over the U.S. territory, and that I think I think that's really why I do see a lot of similarities in building the war movement in the U.S. and in the similar thing in Hong Kong, as they also say, build a wall and drive away all the mainlanders. I think there's, it's not so much about, how different are the Hong Kongese or the mainlander Chinese. I mean, they are not really that different, but it's the capital accumulation, the hierarchy of the economy that drive people into different positions. And so based on my own observations, I think, protest and its struggles is indeed a radicalizing process. But unfortunately, I have to say this, the progressive politics or leftism has not been a major, let's say, major voice in all those protests. And I do see a widespread xenophobia sentiments and very right-wing anti-communist politics involved in the Hong Kong and Taiwan politics. So, we need to observe, but I would be more cautious in let's say, stand with the Hong Kong movement itself. But that's
okay.
That's
all right. Thanks, Jun. Okay, we're going to end with maybe 2 minutes, Isabella. Can you say, and then we'll have to wrap up. So something about Jun already started us off on the question of different kinds of different fractions of capital and different geographical spaces of capital. But what happens to other capital agents?
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for that question, first of all. I would like to stress that I think there are massive structural persistencies in the global economy that tend to be underestimated when we think about development prospects for certain countries. Some research that I'm doing, I have built a new database for exports in the period 1896 to 1906, and we can see that with these export patterns in the last era of globalization, we can predict fairly well the position in the global division of labor for very many countries, which basically means that most countries more or less stay in the position in the global division of labor in which they have been integrated to under imperialism proper. So against that finding, I'm rather pessimistic in terms of, under the current constellation of the global economy, to incorporate new entities in new ways. I think that the COVID crisis poses an interesting opening there, which I anticipate to be a very, very brutal and violent shock in the first place, both with regard to the pandemic, but also as regards the economic consequence of it. I think that deglobalization in the first instance will be most difficult for the weakest regions of the world. At the same time, such a deglobalization trend could present an opening at some point, but I think it's really too early to say. And maybe one more sentence, sorry, just those countries that have caught up are basically the small tigers, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea, and so on that we have talked about, which of course have caught up under very specific political Cold War conditions, with basically support from the core and an invitation by the core to admit them to the club, which it doesn't seem to be in the cards for many other regions these days.
Okay, well, so I want to thank everyone again for attending. I want to thank our organizers and our participants. I want to say publicly that what we forgot to say in the very beginning, that our co-sponsors are Verso Books, Haymarket Books, N+1, Made in China Journal, The Nation, New Politics, Spectre, and the Political Economy Research Institute, Perry. and as well as positions journals. So we are very, very excited that this that we've launched to in such a great way, and we we invite you to follow us on Facebook and to attend our next session on July 2nd. Thanks, everybody, and have a good evening, a good day, a good morning, whatever it is in your part of the world. Thanks again.